There you go.
Professor Massoud, it's a great pleasure to have you here with us in London today. I wondered if you could tell us something about your book, about why Somalia, because if I understand rightly, you're a professor of politics at the University of California in Santa Cruz, and you've done work previously about the rule of law in fragile states. So I wondered what was the motivation for doing some research on Somalia specifically?
So in the United States, thank you for having me, by the way. In the United States, especially in the field of political science, and also in the field of law, places like Somalia have really been studied. In the ways that Somalia has been studied has been in terms of countering terrorism, countering extremism. And after I wrote my first book on Sudan, I wanted to understand the ways that, the first book that I wrote on Sudan really was about the ways that people use law to build states. And I wanted to understand, I felt after I finished writing that book that there was something else besides the law that people were using to build up nations, to build up societies. And I realized that what undergirded the law for a lot of people was religious faith. And that's what took me to Somalia and Somaliland, was trying to understand the ways that people have been using religious faith in all sorts of ways as a means or a mechanism towards building their societies, towards fighting for the things that they believed in, towards creating the politics that they wanted to see in their worlds. And so that's what took me ultimately from Sudan to Somalia and Somaliland. Part of it was the religious homogeneity of the society that I could kind of control for certain variables because it is largely religiously homogenous. There are some religious minorities, but very few. In the conclusion of the book, I reflect on the ways the findings from a book on Somalia could be extrapolated or extended to places that are more religiously plural, like the United States, the UK, India, and other societies.
Having had the privilege of lived for short periods in Sudan, but also having visited Somaliland, I admit that I found it interesting to navigate your book, and the positive sentiment that I have for both of those places, but especially Somaliland actually, because when I visited exactly this as you're describing, the world sees Somalia as a place of disruption and chaos and extremism, and actually it's something else, and I think you bring that out very well in your book, although it starts very dramatically with you in hospital. So I wondered if you could tell us something about what we saw from the jury of the book prize, this kind of unique combination between really in-depth field research and the use of archives. I just wondered if you could tell us something about that.
Every method that a social scientist uses is necessarily incomplete. Doing archival research alone only tells some part of the story. I tried to cross-check what I was learning in the archives, doing research here in the UK, in colonial archives in Oxford, in Durham, in London, in Cambridge as well, with some of the oral histories that were transmitted from people who worked in the colonial administration to their children, to kind of cross-check what I was learning in the archives. And similarly, I tried to cross-check what I was learning from the interviews with archival records, United Nations agency reports, various reports of non-governmental organizations, and books, secondary literature that's been written about Somalia and Somaliland, especially around the history of this part of the world, the history of the Horn of Africa. And what I found is a lot of this history is written by anthropologists, very little by lawyers and political scientists, again, outside of those who are thinking about, and maybe people who have never or very rarely stepped foot in this part of the world, really thinking about violent extremism. And what I learned from going to the Horn of Africa, from traveling there, being with people, learning from them, attending court hearings, doing the archival research, not just the written archival research, but the archival research that's embedded in people's minds and in places where oral histories where histories are transmitted orally rather than in writing, as we do here in the West. What I learned is the ways that the standard interpretations in political science of religion's role in politics, those interpretations were rather thin. They didn't fully account for the myriad ways that people were using religion for all sorts of politics, to fight against colonialism, in the same way that the British were trying to institute their own vision of Islam for the Somali. The British, who were non-Muslims, were trying to institute their own vision of Islam for the Somalis. The ways that dictators in power in Somalia, Mohammed Siad Barre, tried to use religion to promote a certain kind of socialism, and that the ways that Somalis themselves turned to religious faith to fight against dictatorial uses of Islam, and the ways even today that certain religious leaders use religion to demand that women occupy a certain space in society, and the way that women themselves, rather than using discourses of rights that come from international law, maybe turn to discourses of religion and religious faith to do the things that international lawyers hope human rights would be doing. And so you see this kind of ambivalence where religion is used in a variety of different ways as a form of politics. And that's really what I learned by going to Somalia and Somaliland.
I think that that's an interesting challenge, and I think you have quite a challenge in the book, in a way, about that relationship between religion and the rule of law. And I wondered, because there is that challenge in there that maybe we don't understand, well, that those of us who've become a bit irreligious, if I can put it like that, maybe don't appreciate that positive role, actually, of potentially more positive role than it's often painted of religion in that context of building rule of law and governance and societies. I wondered if you had an aim of the book, if there was an audience out there that you were trying to reach, or if there was something that you were trying to achieve, if I can put it.
Yeah, I think about this as I reflect on the book. Once it's been written, I'm able to, I'm not in the thick of the writing, and I reflect on it, and I think about the ways that, for activists for whom religious faith is important. I think, I come from the United States now, I work in the United States, and I think of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Christian who fought for civil rights, for justice, for minorities. He fought against poverty, inequality, and a lot of that was rooted in religious faith. So for a lot of these activists, that's nothing new. What I'm writing about is nothing new. What I am doing is sort of transposing those ideas of the use of religious faith for progressive politics to a place where many in the West would least expect it, Somalia and Somaliland. And with a religion that I think many in the West over the last couple of decades would least expect that to be true, and that is with Islam, and specifically with Sharia, kind of roughly, very commonly translated as Islamic law, but Sharia, of course, is much broader than what we think of here in the West as state law. That said, though, religion, like any system of order and norms and values, like laws, can be bent, can be moved, manipulated, harnessed, taken, usurped, thrown, used as a weapon, used for hope. And so that's part of what I try to show, is that as much as for religious people, religion is divine, religion is part of the divine, it also becomes humanized, it also becomes lived and experienced, just like the law does. I'm trained in law and international law, I identify as a lawyer, and I see remarkable parallels between the ways that religious systems developed and the ways that legal systems develop. It's no surprise that law as a system, kind of especially in Enlightenment Europe and early modern Europe, law came to replace religious systems of order, yet indentured itself in some ways to priests and to churches. I think as societies sort of secularize, religion is still there undergirding the foundation of societies. We're typically accustomed to hearing about that in societies that began as Christian societies, like the United States, for instance. But I think the same can be true ultimately, you know, in the decades down the road, potentially of Muslim majority societies as well.
Thank you for bringing that challenge to anybody who wants to read the book, and thank you for throwing a light on the positives of Somalia as well. I really appreciated that. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
It was probably longer than